Great. So yeah, to kick us off, we're going to do some introductions for our speakers, and Frank will add a little bit more color to what ADL Ventures does and, what services we're here to provide as a power connector for this FOA. Then we'll provide some insights on our part on market transformation plans, how things will be scored, what, to keep in mind as you're working on your application. We'll have some discussion and real life insight from our speakers, and then break for a brief Q&A. So if, we have some structured Q&A time, but if there's anything that comes up as we're speaking, definitely either put it in the chat or hold on to it, because we will get to those questions at the end. So in a second, I'll just hand it off to our speakers to talk a little bit about their career path and their experience in the clean energy industry, as well as what tech they've worked with within that. So, some experience isn't CSP specific, but there are great takeaways that can be transferable, to any entrepreneur, engineer, founder. So I will hand it off to AJ to kick us off and give a little bit more insight on his career path.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I've been in solar for the last 25 years, primarily on the photovoltaic side, and saw photovoltaics move from experimental to mainstream, primarily through the lens of data. So my expertise is in the data acquisition, data pre-processing, processing, and analysis side, as well as the numerical modeling. And been able to look at these power plants through a variety of lenses, on the performance side, as well as the operations and maintenance side. So just thinking about, not only do you have to build these plants, but that you have to have good data for somebody to maintain them over the lifetime of the project. What I saw in PV world was that the collection of good data led to photovoltaics becoming an asset class. So you can now go to any bank and get an unsecured loan for a PV power plant, which is far different than it was 25 years ago, where you probably couldn't get the money even if you had it in the bank to loan. So I think the robust data has given that technology enough data to become an asset class, and be interesting to see, what can happen with CSP. Julian?
Here I am. Thank you. Just want to make sure, as I'm coming a little late, people can see me and hear me. Great.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, great. So, my journey started at Solar City back in 2007. I was actually an installer, and very quickly, as that organization was growing, it became clear we needed to write process and develop processes for how to teach lots and lots of people how to do this work. And so I moved into the corporate offices there and worked with kind of the products team there. So my background is really more in the implementation of products, the adoption of products into the project development lifecycle. And so I think I come a little bit more from that lens. Coming up through Solar City, we were working on, if you know the solar space, everything from just what racking hardware to use on a given roof type to eventually working with Powerwall as Tesla was developing that. We did the acquisition of Zep Solar, which was kind of not a overly kind of unique asset class or hardware class in a sense, but took a different view on where to put the functions of the technology and how to have a technology that's maybe more expensive up front, but the operational costs are you realize the benefits and the operational costs. After leaving Solar City, which, very quickly after I left, was purchased by Tesla, I joined 10K Solar in their last round, and this was really, 10K was a pretty fascinating product in my hometown of Minneapolis, and a pretty fascinating product as it was taking a kind of a unconventional view on how to package up solar cells, inverters, the entire kit. And so I think it was very applicable to kind of what's you know, a lot of these groups are probably thinking about in terms of having to kind of prove yourself out all the way down to the data level. Are you modelable? I liked some of what AJ was saying there. Those were some of the big challenges for 10K. And then most recently, the last 7 years, have been working with my partners on a regional development shop here in the upper Midwest. And we've done some novel things like, I think, early adoption of bifacial tech, probably one of the first, if not the first groups to be financing that with third parties in, at least in the Minnesota or the upper Midwest market, just as an example. And I focus on just what are all of those technologies that are coming in the DER space, especially on the distribution space. So a lot of how do we get to, you know, thinking a lot about this through the lens of what are the risks and challenges in the project itself, a little bit later stage than just the kind of fundamental technology validation.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. Moving on, I'm going to hand this slide off to Frank, and he'll talk a little bit more about what we do as ADL, and then we can get into it.
Okay, great. So I'm Frank Yang. I'm a partner with ADL Ventures and also two-time founder in the clean energy space. It was in solar for about 12 years. And I think, as most of you know, we're a power connector supporting not only the CSP program, but a number of other DOE funding opportunities as well. And so I'll talk a little bit about what ADL does, as well as sort of lay the groundwork for how specifically we're assisting on this particular FOA, and then we'll leave plenty of our time for our speakers to talk about their past experiences and go through some Q&A. So ADL broadly is a venture development firm. We work with both corporate and government clients, as well as some emerging startups as well, to develop and launch new businesses, as well as run various venture development programs. So we have been a power connector for NREL since 2020 and have supported them on over 25 prizes. And that support also extends, as I mentioned, sometimes to formal funding opportunity announcements like this one. Next slide. So our role in this particular FOA is specifically focused around the market transformation plan. But I think, as some of you are aware, University of Arizona is also a power connector, and we're sort of working jointly to cover a number of capabilities. And so I think there are other questions around budgets and other related topics which can be directed to us as well. ADL typically, we conduct these support sessions through one-on-one engagements, and then we will have some office hours and potentially some additional peer exchanges as well. So as Nicole has a Calendly link which she'll be sharing, which you can use to request one-on-one meetings with us. Great. So I want to recap. I know a lot of you have probably looked at this in the FOA, but where does the market transformation plan fit in? And I think this will sort of drive some of the commentary in our webinar today. So I think there's two key takeaways around the market transformation plan. One is sort of particularly for the early stage technologies, just identifying the target market and the channels and like what you're going to sell and how you're going to be selling it. And then obviously in the CSP business, which is a very complex system-driven industry, really all the details that go behind the product development, from bankability on the financing side to all the technical specs like long-term reliability, measuring and monitoring your performance. And so I think there's a host of topics where our speakers are going to provide relevant background today. And at the end of the day, the market transformation plan is part of a work plan that's 50% of the scoring criteria for this FOA. So want to remind folks that ADL is not formally involved in the review process, but our team has a lot of experience putting together both successful and unsuccessful proposals. And one thing I'd say about the market transformation plan and the product development plan is it really sort of sets a tone for the rest of your application, in the sense that when I've reviewed these applications in the past as a reviewer for other opportunities, I always try to see if there's a market direction and a strategic guidance that really is going to lead this into the marketplace. And I think in this particular FOA, there's 3 tiers of projects, as we'll talk about in the next slide. And I think all of them have very unique challenges associated with the market transformation elements. I think being able to master those and you know, justify those properly in your application is going to be really one of the key components to you know, focus on. And as I mentioned, we're here to provide comprehensive support, and you know, folks should not be shy to schedule one-on-ones or otherwise send us materials for review. You know, so I think, as most of you know, the by now the FOA is actually broken into 3 tiers as well as 3 topic areas. And so we wanted to make sure that this webinar was going to be broadly useful for all types of applicants across both technology stages and technology you know, types. And I think this is just a table that's meant to show sort of the different things that come into play when you're looking at all these different stages of you know, development. Obviously, when you think about sort of the earlier stage development, there's some like very fundamental specifications, usually that relate to cost and performance, and a couple of other ancillary measures that are important. I think obviously as you go closer and closer to the field, the things like mechanical, moisture, wind, other you know, sort of variables that you don't see in sort of a laboratory or modeling environment, you know, start to come into play. And you know, I think certainly when you think about the tier 3 projects, which can be up to $10 million, really the demonstration of scale and the validation from a future construction and financing perspective are really important, because I think construction and government projects can be complex from a paperwork standpoint, and you know, certainly these are challenging technologies to scale, and there's a lot of detail that you need to get right, not only around what you're going to build, but how you're going to build it, and then how you're going to measure the success of it later on. So I think measuring and monitoring the success is something that I think both of our speakers, but particularly AJ, is going to talk about you know, quite a bit. Next slide. So I like to put this slide up just to show sort of like, you know, where do you usually start out as a founder, and where do you usually start out sort of writing these proposals. So I think certainly for those of you in tier 1, a lot of you probably, beyond a couple of basic specifications, like I said, on the cost and performance side, actually don't know where you're going to be navigating to, but you're going to have to sort of find this out, you know, very quickly. And that's the purpose of market discovery, and that's the purpose of sort of initial engagement. So I put this slide up as sort of an example and sort of as a guiding point to say, hey, don't be intimidated if you don't have anything. That's sort of the genesis of our title for this, you know, webinar, is that, you know, most of you are going to really come in not with a great idea of like exactly what you're going to develop. And then our goal between now and the submission of the FOA is to give you a much better idea, and to say that, hey, the information probably will be imperfect, but you're going to have a lot of conversations and a lot of iteration that's going to help you develop a very credible story around what you're developing. Next slide. So filling out the blanks, I mean, I can't emphasize enough, even though it's not explicitly written in the FOA, you know, how important sort of third-party conversations are going to be. And so I think starting out with a really diverse, you know, base of stakeholders, and then having very specific questions and very tactically oriented interviews to find out, you know, what the market is looking for. And I think there's certainly NSF I-Core and a number of other programs that are you know, out in the open, that you can sort of see what other people have done. And the goal of all of this is to get to as good of a target spec as possible for what you're developing, not only what you're developing today, but what you need to develop tomorrow to get into the marketplace. Because certainly if you're a tier 1 award, you eventually want to get to that tier 2 and tier 3 stage. And even if you're tier 3 already, there's still a long way to go, probably, to get to sort of large scale, you know, profitable implementation of your technology. And so I think the 3 of us here as speakers have been there before, have been through those challenges, and know that it's not easy. But I think there's a systematic way that you can phase out risk, as we're going to talk about. And then the last thing I just want to do before we, you know, sort of hand it off to our speakers is just talking about sort of how important the feedback loop is. I want to emphasize that even in the course of the next couple of weeks and months, as you finish your proposal, and then you conduct other commercial activity that's maybe related to your proposal, you may change your spec and you may change your product design, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8 times or more. And I think it's important to realize, particularly if you're in those early stages, that sometimes failing can be good and making mistakes can be good, because a small failure now can prevent a large mistake later. And so when you're you know, prototyping a product, especially early on, like getting that feedback and then sort of feeding that using that to sort of feed your product development and iteration is really, really important. And so I think as we go through this process, I just can't emphasize enough how important it is to not only go to the power connectors, but to other stakeholders you may be engaging in industry for continued advice and support. So with that, I want to sort of shift gears a little bit and let our speakers talk about their experiences, some of their key relevant experiences in industry, and then we'll also leave plenty of time for questions and discussion here.
Sorry, realized I was on mute. I'm going to hand it off to our speakers. This is kind of, the impression we got from certain projects and, what those key takeaways were. We could start with AJ and then go to Julian to speak on their real life experiences in the industry.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously with CSV, reliability of the control systems are a big thing. And since these are concentrating technologies, you can't really use a lot of the off-the-shelf measurement and verification tools, especially for the solar resource. I remember going to a workshop at the National Renewable Energy Lab where they were talking about ways to measure 10,000 full sun, right? And that's pretty crazy because you would totally torch any kind of pyranometer or diode or, any kind of reference cell, anything that could measure that. You're also dealing with a lot of data as well with these, especially at the megawatt scale. You've got all the heliostats and the positioning, and there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of electromechanical activities. So, my expectation with these projects is that, being able to bring down some of the monitoring costs is a big deal, to the overall. It's not the highest priority to start with, but you can't have very expensive equipment, multiplied by all the devices out there. So, the Internet of Things gives us a lot of flexibility, new protocols such as MQTT as compared to Modbus and other things. Really allow a new way of sharing data. And, I'm not sure on what people are going to come up with, but if communicating between heliostats or between each of these directly with the monitoring system and being able to swap out components without having to reprogram the main controllers and all these things, those might be innovations within this industry. And can't tell you exactly what that is because I'm not coming out with new CSV technologies, but just some of the things that I can think of and which might help folks. And then you have outside of the control system, you've got the measurement and verification of those control systems. So these might be systems that are more expensive, that are used, just through the prototyping stage and the pilot stage and maybe the early commercial units, but won't be a scaling factor for that. But you need to make sure that what you're getting is the correct information and that it's, I think one of the main things in the pilots and looking at the data of pilots is what are you trying to prove out at a smaller scale that might be able to be, we'll call it digitally scalable. How can we get results from a large plant from smaller data sets that we can get using higher quality instrumentation, and what does the experimental design look like for that? Maybe a consideration that that's used through this fall. Julianne?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll speak a little bit to some of the 10K lessons first, and then I'm going to circle back and I'm going to echo AJ's comments about data, and I'll give you some examples of where we got really tripped up in both across 10K and Nokomis. So for those of you not familiar, 10K Solar was a novel solar technology that basically took the same silicon cells and attempted to wire them in a more matrixed fashion, creating it was more of a low voltage, high current environment, but a very safe environment. It had integrated power electronics, could be very dense, and could really be shade resistant, shade tolerant at the submodule level. The core lessons from it, in my mind, and I should say, there is a group called Global Race that is working on bringing a version of this technology back to market. So, but the core challenges that we always saw with the technology was that while the core concept leveraged solar cells, traditional solar cells, and so in that sense, we were leveraging kind of the market as it was scaling, the design of the product meant we had to basically invent everything else. And so, the module itself was the proprietary IP, which was great. And that was like the core vision of the product, was to make a better module. And you'll still talk to people today who are diehards to tell you this is the best module they've ever had, and the best module they've ever worked with. But they also ended up, because of the way they wanted to design it, having to also invent an kind of a new inverter architecture. They had to work with low voltage inverters. And so that meant they were now getting outside of their core competency of modules and really having to go into the inverter space as well. And so in that sense, they weren't able to leverage the other aspects of the industry that were scaling: racking, inverters. The regulatory environment around inverters is very high. So inverters are like a classic example of the type of thing where you may not see them from a bill of materials standpoint as super expensive in the project, but they are the brain. And you can have the greatest solar panels in the world, but if you don't have the best inverters, if you don't have good inverter solutions, you'll never get them onto the grid. So my kind of rules of thumb are: don't invent more than you need to, and solve your problem, bring your value scale, but don't feel like you've got to invent a solution at every turn. You may eventually get there. That may eventually be what you are, but I think you'll do it better by being really focused on how to bring your ideas to market within the ecosystem or the market that's scaling, and not think that you're going to come in and just take over the entire thing. CSP may be in a different place, but I'll speak a little bit to kind of how I think CSP can leverage existing markets as well. So I think that's one point. Don't invent more than you need to, and leverage the market that's scaling wherever you can, as opposed to thinking you're going to invent everything new. The other thing, and this starts to get a little bit to the data piece, is that I think you're going to be doing stuff that seems novel and kind of first of a kind in a sense. And I think one of the things that is very hard to do, obviously, is you can't have tons of data about something that you haven't done yet. And so while you need data, you also need proof points of where what you're doing isn't really unique at a component or process level. So as an example, and again, I have no idea, I don't know enough about CSP, but there are places where a lot of what you're doing, whether it's heating up fluids or doing heat transfer to electricity generation, or reflecting light, or things, just very, very basic things that, like, what you're doing collectively may be novel, but you could break each of them down to the components and say, well, this has been done over here at scale. This has been done over here at scale. This has been done over here at scale. And now you can point to data to get over that first of a kind of hump that you eventually want to just get there with the data from your own systems. So I think that idea of finding proof points for I think of it as kind of components or mechanical or chemical processes or whatever it is you're doing within the larger plant, I think is a very valuable way to think about how you get over first of a kind type humps. When we were at 10K, we ran into some examples of this where our holistic package of how you modeled the system. So if you're in the PV space, if you're in the solar electric space, you probably know that PV Syst is the kind of core product that we use, kind of industry-wide, sets the standard for how you model energy generation and how you have arguments over how much yield you're going to get out of a system, and then you have the weather file arguments and things like that. Well, PV Syst wasn't built very well for 10K, and 10K couldn't figure out how to leverage it probably because of its technology. it was better fitted for a software platform called SAM, which is an NREL model, system advisory model. And SAM could model it quite well, but SAM wasn't used broadly by the industry. And so now you were left with, well, I can show you that it can work, but I'm showing you with a tool that you're not that familiar with, that isn't your first go-to for financiers being familiar with it. And so that was just another place where you kind of ran into a combination of that, having to invent things, and that because you're breaking your technology and thinking about the customer adoption cycle, but also that like you couldn't just turn to PVSys to say, well, you can model it in PVSys, and if you could do that, a lot of things would go away, and you might want to make some decisions at least early in your product adoption cycle to say, I want to be able to be demonstrated against processes or materials or steps that have been used before, and I might have to make some sacrifices early in my product, knowing that once people are bought in, I can come back and give them a new tool that's underwritable. When I flipped to kind of Nokomis, I would say we were doing less like really novel adoption of tech. I'd say more of my time at Solar City, which was just early days for solar in general, and then 10K, which was itself novel tech adoption. But at Nokomis, one of the biggest things we did is we were there very early in the adoption of bifacial modules. And here I would say absolutely data was our biggest friend. Obviously, I think bifacial modules were able to be adopted fairly easily because you already had scaled manufacturing tech and you had warranties from the best manufacturers in the world kind of coming behind it. The argument was really around how much benefit am I getting? And as a developer, you're trying to pre-capture that benefit, right? You're trying to argue that, hey, when we go into construction, I'm going to get my development fee, and it's going to be sized based on the yield with a 6 to 10% adder because of the bifaciality. And the independent engineer or the underwriter is sitting there saying, no, like I'll give you like 3%, but we just don't have enough data to validate that in that application in Minnesota with that type of, vegetation, you're going to have sheep running around chewing on pollinator plants. And how do I know that you're actually going to get a 3% boost? The best thing we could do is in the portfolio before we started using bifacial broadly, we put in one inverter's worth of bifacial where we effectively didn't take any benefit on it. And that gave us a control in an actual commercial setting where we had a commercial, monofacial product with the exact same setup on the exact same site, with the exact same inverters, the exact same module count, with the exact same everything, almost down to the, literal positions of the panels, such that you could just turn and you could say, well, where is all the good data where both of those inverters are running clean, no issues in the strings, et cetera. Now I've got a very, very isolated, very real world experience. And, lo and behold, the next time we went to finance, some of that data was very valuable. And I think even just showing that we were doing it was meaningful to people. And so, since basically 2019, we were able to basically just move 100% bifacial, and we've seen the benefits show up significantly. But that was like an example of where we really just decided as the project developer to generate some of our own data as a way to help the industry's larger movement to show proof points. Those are a couple examples I've got.
Yeah, no, that was great. Super helpful, especially in terms of demonstrating technology. We can move on. These are just kind of some key takeaways to glean from this talk, and I'm sure with the added discussion from our speakers, there's more that we could put on this slide, but these are just a few. Obviously wanting to start early and think about risks at this point. And I'd like to open it up for Q&A at this point. I'm wondering if there's any questions right off the bat from applicants that are in the meeting right now. If not, we have, maybe more of a structured Q&A based on the tier of your technology. But yeah, I'd like to just open it up. If anybody have thoughts, feel free to put it in the chat or come off mute. Anyone? If there's no, upfront questions, maybe we can look at these and, have our speakers, if you feel compelled to give an answer or, have experience with any of these, shout it out. But yeah, open to anything.
Nicole, if you could go back one slide.
Yep.
On the starting early, when you talk to the owners, operators, underwriters, engineers, financiers, this is obviously very important, especially when thinking about pilots. You're not going to want to start out with your megawatt scale. You're going to want to start out with, what are people worried about, on the investment side, on the development side. There's going to be some great advice and good things for you to think about here. And then there's going to be some really off the wall wacky stuff, but perception is reality as well. So you have to make sure that you're prepared. And while you're doing some of these upfront prototypes, it might be worthwhile, can we get the information that we need for both what you consider to be actual and perceived problems, right? Because that's what's going to be a good way to get the biggest bang for your buck out of any kind of prototype and pilot, is really being able to address things. Julian, I really liked what you brought up about, I could bring up two comments. One is the component level, right?
Yep.
What of those components are people most worried about, and where are you going to want to spend your time proving that you've overcome the barriers of either past technologies, or if there's nothing in the past, what people are looking at on that. And I also, was going to bring up, it's funny, NREL SAM, because they do have CSP modules, where Assist has nothing at all with CSP from what I remember. However, that is very important on the finance side, right? That yes, you might have this great model, but if nobody is going to put money on it, what is that deal? So I mean, that is very important. And these are conversations up front with what kind of models are you going to accept or not up front. A lot of people are really surprised that that a model like SAM that's developed with models from a number of different national labs isn't considered bankable, even though it's been validated many times more than PV system. So it's again, it's perception, right? And especially from the people that are be giving you money. So just two little points up there to really start thinking about your prototypes and thinking about your pilots up front when you're talking with people, because it's much better to get that information up front as you think about your development strategy than it is, finding about it last minute and having to scramble to put together a plan to try to prove or disprove something.
Yeah, I think those are good points. And I'll say, I think we're at a point today, maybe just to defend Sam, I think we're at a point today where there is a broader sense of acceptance. And I think we are seeing bankability of that product. But definitely, you went back 7 years ago, people were more interested in seeing your helioscope than they were your SAM model. And so you want to give some props to Enroll and the team at SAM that's done, it's done a good job with an impressive product that just wasn't early in the adoption cycle for the industry like PVSys was.
Yeah. That's one of those perception things, right?
Yeah, great example of the perception. The other thing I think about point one that you're saying, and I think about this when I talk about it from a project development lens, is just like, what are the conditions precedent to actually getting financing in the project? That's like, in the project developer's lens, you're always targeting that. Hey, I need money to construct. I need money to pay this interconnection fee, whatever. And all those financiers are going to say, okay, I can give you this money if you show me X, Y, and Z, on these commercial terms. And so this start early, it's really a product discovery, market discovery, product discovery exercise in a sense, where you're trying to say, like you said, what are the really important data points that you're going to need? What are the documents or studies or things you're going to need, proof points, in order to unlock the different types of capital needed to actually get these projects built and operating. And so that's a lot of what I think I mean when I say, start early and talk to these groups is, I like what you're saying about where are the concerns, where are the issues, but also just like what are those actual deliverables? What actually checks the box to get you there? And the reality is they can't tell you that, and when you go through a financing exercise in the project development world, you always get very frustrated that the financier can't come and just tell you everything they need. But they have to learn it in advance too. They have to get lawyers and independent engineers to qualify or support the claims. And so understanding who those groups are or what those processes are they're going to go through are again helpful to discover who's really helping the capital make the decision, and thus who really holds the keys and can define the market and the product you need. Make sure that you're not taking just the capital's word, but whoever the capital turns to in order to make their decisions.
Yeah, I see Joseph's raising a hand, and we have Matt with a question in the chat. So I guess, Joseph, go for it, and then we'll get to Matt's question.
Okay, thanks. Hi, guys. Thank you all for what you do. It's really great to see your relevant experience here and get these perspectives. Coming from a technology side, I think we've done a fair amount of work looking at the technology stakeholders, things like supply chains and technical risk and stuff like that. I'm sitting here looking at the calendar with the next 2 weeks available, looking at what other stakeholders provide the best bang for the buck to get their thumbs up on in the short time I have left. And I guess the two categories that are sticking out for me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm hearing about financiers and I'm hearing about customers. Do you have any insights going for a tier one, what the DOE may feel, and this is a very blanket statement, right? I'm sure it's different for every proposal in what it's proposing. What the DOE might say, okay, this is a more important stakeholder. I would rather hear from a financier versus a customer, or I'd rather hear about the adoption from a customer versus the financing up. Like, could I throw a blanket statement of, okay, if we meet this sort of LCOH target, then I'm just going to assume the financing is doable. Versus, do the customers actually want this? Do you have any insights on that?
Is that
Hey,
Frank? You want to speak to that? Yeah.
Yeah, this is I guess, Nicole, I'm going to jump back in here since this is probably more in the purview of the power connector as opposed to the speaker. So first of all, I want to repeat what we said at the beginning, that the power connectors are not involved in the merit review process, but certainly based on reviewing the FOA in detail and sort of years of both being accepted and rejected for these proposals, I would share a couple of general takeaways. And this actually sort of ties into some points that I wanted to share on sort of the different tiers of the FOA. And so I think that we're very fortunate to be living in an environment today where there's more funding options available in these FOAs than there ever were before, because there's been more money and more sort of policy support with the IRA. So traditionally, your FOA of this type did not have 3 different tiers, and I think there's 3 different tiers, for exactly part of the reason you specified, because I think there's certainly some applications that are going to be more technically sound, but less proven from a commercial standpoint, and then there's others that are going to be, I think, at the point where they're sort of ready for a supercharge from a scaling perspective. And so I would look at that very differently in a tier 1, tier 2 versus a tier 3 application. I think in tier 1, and I'm just saying this from my perspective, as if I were the writer, again, it's not a formal opinion. I would say that I'd be very focused on that cost and performance, and I'd be very focused on that those ancillary specifications, as well as some initial indication of like commercial offtake and financing interest, right? But it's not the expectation. I think for a tier 1 project, you're going to have firm contract or even an LOI with an investor or be on somebody's whitelist. But I think it is going to be pretty important that you have a compelling story around cost, performance, and other critical market specifications. And obviously, sort of the closer you get to tier 2 and tier 3, the more that's going to change, because again, if you sort of look at the entire landscape of DOE funding, $10 million is like much larger than you would typically get in a research driven FOA, and that is more looked at as a demonstration type of funding. So not only do you have to bring the financial cost share, but there are proof points, as Julian alluded to, that are typically expected for that type of deployment. So if you haven't done something at a tenth of that scale before, I think typical industry reviewer is going to look at it and say, hey, there's a low likelihood that I would bet on these guys being able to do it well right off the bat, whether that's true or not. And so I think, listen, at the end of the day, I think all these programs are guided by sort of overarching program goals. Obviously, a lot of us in the PV world leveraged the sunshot and sort of different aspects of that for PV cost reduction. I think similarly in this FOA, the language around LCOH is really strong, and I think the cost compression and the scaling on an LCOH basis has been a challenge for the CSP industry. But obviously, the further you get, the more that needs to be complemented by those commercial proof points. So I think it's a balance. I would certainly say in my own experience that in the sort of the tier 1 type proposals, your work is going to be 80-90% technical and maybe 10-20% commercial. But that 10-20% commercial is still going to be really, really important. And then as you get more to the tier 2 and tier 3, you're going to find that more and more of your time is spent, like I said, thinking about things like the construction, the execution, the financing. And I think most importantly, like, what does this demonstration scale, really buy you? I think we'll look at transformation, and that scaling that's really, because if this is going to be a one-off and it's not going to be able to be utilized for replication or scaling in a market of interest, then I think it's harder to make the case of impact, right? And all of you are writing in your proposals also about the impact of DOE funding. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a backdrop of like what's in this particular FOA and how you may approach it depending on your.
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. And we can go to Matt's question in the chat now. He says, I'm interested in your experience establishing a basis for performance guarantees and backing those through insurance brokers and secondary markets with early stage technologies. CSP has a challenge compared to PV in that the individual module is necessarily large, so it's as practical to build a pilot at risk. Any initial thoughts, responses to that?
Well, I can, to start with that, when I was at Obnidian, Obnidian offered performance guarantees for commercial and residential PV arrays. And it really came down to the performance engineers working at the company and, what their professional, opinion was. And, bifacial PVs came up because, Obnidian was on the hook for whatever they were going to give the performance guarantee. If it was less than that, they would lose money, right? It wasn't just about the operations and maintenance, but also the baseline performance of the technology. And there were many, many conversations of, should it be, as Julian brought up, the 6 to 10% or 3 or even less percent than that. Because the models were much more complex. You had to do ray tracing and other things that are very similar to CSP as compared to the more bulk measurements that you could take for assessing performance of PV arrays from the R&D perspective. And the model, the upfront performa model, what are you going to get for back a module irradiance, for example, and how much of that is going to be shaded by the combiner boxes and by the wiring. And it's not as easy to clean the backside of the modules and all these things that made it very difficult to do the upfront modeling as compared to just, unifacial modules where you could, look at shading and all these other things in a much more concrete way. So I would say really it comes down to, I mean, in those initial conversations, who even would give a performance guarantee or the insurance, and really talking to them up front, because it's really going to come down to the professional opinions of, of those that are making the determination of what performance guarantee will be.
It's it's a great point that like people hold the keys here. It's not going into an algorithm and then out it pops. Obviously, the more the algorithm says the same thing over and over, and the more people kind of have validated or agree on the algorithm, the more that we can turn it over to that. But as an example of a scenario like I can think of around bifacial, again using that example, I can think of multiple financiers I talked to, and one in particular where he would get the IE, the independent engineer, to give a view on it, and he'd look at what the independent engineer said, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to go talk to another one." And literally, knowing the 7 or 8 engineering groups that are willing to walk into this space and figuring out which ones of them have the individuals that most align with what you think is part of just figuring it out. You've got to eventually figure it out. Now you've got that person's report that you can put in front of it as opposed to anybody's. The idea that all engineers are the same, I'm sure most people on this call know, is not the truth. And it's the same way in that independent engineering exercise. It's the same way in that insurance space. And so I think of insurers, I think of independent engineers as like critical early entities to try to engage with, because so much so they are the ones actually saying what they think the data says, or obviously offering the products that are needed to get through the scale gap. So I don't know, that probably doesn't answer very specifically. I'd have to really dig in on your exact tech to take a deeper view on it. But I think you have to think about those groups as very early stakeholders, and you've got to figure out who in those stakeholders you think are, maybe to say it another way, your best independent champions, without, while them still being able to represent their industries and their views as opposed to your desires.
Great. Any other questions, last thoughts? I don't think we have anything else in the chat. We are coming up on the hour here. And yeah, not hearing anything. So I think we are good for today, and this will be sent out to everybody. I will figure out a way to a good channel for that. But I think that's it for today. Thank you, Joseph, for coming, and thank you to our speakers, AJ and Julian. We really appreciated your insight. And with that, I will let everybody go. Thank you so much.
Thanks all. Keep it
Yeah.
up.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Okay. Good luck. Bye.